I feel way different because it's like I know he's not there.
These are the voices of those closest to execution.
He's not in my mind anymore, really. Because when he was alive, he was there, and that's just what I didn't want him to be.
When the time comes for execution, this is where it happens. We are now inside the execution chamber. Utah has executed 8 men.
I still support the death penalty in certain cases.
I think there's better ways to deal with even the most heinous of crimes.
You get to a point where you become complacent. You don't think it's going to happen, and then snap, something happens, and that's kind of what happened with my brothers.
I'm Jim Spiewak, and we're taking an in-depth look at the death penalty in Utah, its history, its impact, and what the future holds. From the decline in death sentences across the nation to the financial implications of capital punishment, Utah finds itself at a bit of a crossroads. We're going to hear from legal experts, former prosecutors, family of victims, and family of the condemned, and everyday Utahns as we examine whether or not this practice of justice still has a place in our state.
Messed us up, messed me up a lot.
For me, it was closure.
Utah has executed 8 men. The most recent execution was Taberon Honie, who died by lethal injection just past midnight on August 8, 2024. Honie was on death row for more than 25 years for killing his ex-girlfriend's mother, Claudia Ben.
It's not there, wondering when it's going to happen and how many more appeals he's going to go through and whatever else he's going to throw out there to try to stay alive.
Ben's daughter, Benita Yursheta, waited more than half of her life to see Honie executed. She was there on August 8th to witness it.
I didn't know how it was going to be to see there, to watch him take his last breath. But to me, it was a relief.
But an execution has 2 sides, the victim and the condemned.
It was almost surreal. It just didn't seem real to none of us at all.
Randy Gardner is the older brother of Ronnie Lee Gardner, who was executed by firing squad in Utah in 2010. Randy argues the government should not have the right to end a life.
When it happened and after it happened, it was like, wow, did this really happen? Is this a nightmare? This just don't seem real.
As of January 1st, 2024, there are 2,216 people on death row in the United States, 7 in Utah. The inmates' cases span several decades, with sentencing dates ranging from 1985 to 1996, highlighting the long duration inmates spend on death row, spanning decades. The longest-serving current death row inmate is Douglas Stewart Carter, sentenced on December 27, 1985. Carter's case has been a whirlwind. He was convicted of stabbing an elderly Provo woman 10 times during a botched robbery in 1985, then shooting her in the back of the head at point-blank range. Carter's sentence was overturned because the jury was improperly instructed, but was resentenced in 1992. Then in 2022, the court vacated his sentence altogether, and it's currently being appealed all the way up to the Utah Supreme Court.
And I know from talking to many victims, families over the years, that each time there's a new delay, it tears open the wounds that they suffered in the beginning of the case.
Other notable inmates include Troy Michael Kell, sentenced back on August 8, 1996, for the brutal stabbing death of a fellow inmate who was stabbed 67 times. Kell's execution is set to be by firing squad. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, Utah prosecutors have pursued fewer death penalty cases over the last 30 years. So we set out to answer questions around the use of the death penalty, its impact, and what may be in store for one of the most serious orders the government carries out. Utah has a complex and storied history with the death penalty, marked by legal shifts, notable executions, and a fluctuating death row population. Following the U.S. Supreme Court's 1972 ruling in Furman versus Georgia, which led to the temporary suspension of the death penalty nationwide, Utah's death penalty statutes were revised. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty, Utah has carried out 8 executions. The first of these was the execution of Gary Gilmore by firing squad on January 17, 1977, and Gilmore's case is significant because it marked the first execution in the U.S. after the death penalty moratorium was lifted.
All these years later, it's still emotional to give that order and know that within 5 minutes he'd be dead. That does weigh on you, and I think it weighs on prosecutors.
Former Utah Attorney General Mark Shurtleff has given the order for someone to be executed. The subsequent executions included 2 more by firing squad and 5 by lethal injection. The Utah legislature passed a law back in 2004 banning firing squad as an option for execution. That method could continue for inmates that chose it before the law change. For those after 2004, firing squad can only be used if lethal injection is deemed to be unconstitutional or the state cannot secure a lethal injection dose.
I still support the death penalty in certain cases. I trust a jury that ends up deciding that, and obviously they take it very seriously.
Fast forward to the 1990s, and death penalty sentences across the U.S. have steadily declined. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, new death sentences dropped from 166 in 2002 to just 21 in 2023. Utah mirrors that trend, with fewer cases being pursued each year. And in the 1990s, Utah saw as many as 6 new death sentences in a single year.
While I understand, and you have to respect both sides of the argument, the feelings of all the parties involved, I think all of this is an example of why we should be considering eliminating the death penalty in Utah.
We are here on the site of the Utah State Prison in Salt Lake, and behind me is the building where it houses the first security checkpoint, and it's in one of the buildings behind here where these executions take place. Let's go ahead and show you. So we just got through a security checkpoint, which is very similar to what you would see at the airport. It's very, very thorough. We are now standing in a fenced-off area where there are 2 security gates. We'll go through this one on our way to the max security site. Now, on the site of the prison property, there are about 430 full-time employees that work here. About 120 to 140 are working the day shift, and 80 work the night shift. Once we get through this gate, we will head over to where the death chamber is housed. After walking a few hundred yards from the main security entrance gate, we are now in a building here just a couple yards away from the front of the property, and joining us now is Glenn Mills. He is the Director of Communications for the Utah Department of Corrections. So Glenn, tell us where we are standing right now.
Okay, we are in the front part of the Antelope building. This is where we have what would be most commonly known as maximum security or restrictive housing, as it's also known.
Okay.
So this is where inmates are placed in a more restrictive setting based on behavior, and it's also where we house the death chamber.
Okay, so with respect to death row, once an execution warrant is signed by the judge, where do the inmates go from there? I know every case is a little bit different, but kind of standard operating procedure.
And here, death row isn't necessarily what we think of when we think of Hollywood death row. Inmates that are on death row, so to speak, can be in general population. It's all based on their behavior and their willingness to grow and change. So most of our death row inmates actually are in general population. A few of them are here in the restrictive housing area, again, based on their behavior. So what would happen is if a death warrant is signed, if someone were in general population, that's when we would start to move them over to this restrictive housing unit to begin that process.
And are they also then here, it's kind of the days leading up to and the day of the execution?
Correct.
They're in this building.
Exactly.
All right, let's go ahead and check out the death chamber.
Okay.
All right. We're now in the area of the execution chamber. Behind this wall is where the execution chamber is. Down this hallway right here, I do want to show you this because witnesses do have to witness these executions. These are 2 of the 4 witness rooms right here. These doors lead into those rooms. In the most recent execution, I was a witness to Taberon Honie's execution, and this is the room that me and 7 other people were in. As you can see, this room isn't very large, but it was enough to hold me and 7 other people the night of Honie's execution. So this is the window right here, the curtain. It will draw open when the execution is ready. We got in here about 15 minutes before midnight, so we waited in here for about 15 minutes before the execution started, watching through this window right here. Okay, so now we're in another room. Glenn, tell us where we're at right now.
So this is the observation cell. The most recent one, Mr. Honie, which you have referenced, he was moved here about 18 hours prior to the execution. So this is where he essentially spent his final day. You'll remember that night we were offering hourly updates on what was happening. This is exactly where all of that was taking place. Inside the cell here is where he was. Family were able to come in essentially 2 at a time and have visits with him throughout that day. You may remember we talked about all the family members that were here and were coming in and visiting with him, and then we offered those updates to the public. And then just to the left of us over here is where correctional officers were observing everything that was taking place that day. And then that information was taken to our command center, or was delivered to our command center, I should say, and that's where I was able to get that information then to go down for our hourly update.
When the time comes for execution, this is where it happens. We are now inside the execution chamber. This is the lethal injection table. Again, this was the method of the most recent execution for Taberon Honie. He was already in this. He was latched up. He had the IVs in by the time the curtain was drawn. This is one of the witness rooms. As you can see, the people inside this room cannot see through this glass to who is on the other side in the witness room. Important to note, the executioner is not shown. So the IV lines, they come through one of these slots right here, and the executioner is on the other side of this wall, so we never see who the executioner is. This is lethal injection. There's a second type of execution that's allowed here in Utah. It's firing squad. So the gun barrels will come out of either this slot or this slot right here, and here is the chair that the inmate sits in for firing squad. Okay, so Glenn, it doesn't really matter which type of execution. I guess the process is the same. So who's in the room during the actual execution?
So 2 members of the UDC team are in the room. They're technically considered part of the death team. That would be the warden, who in this instance most recently was Bart Mortensen, and also the chief of the Division of Prison Operations, Randall Honie. You noticed from the witness room, both of them were in the room, they were visible, they were in their Class A uniforms.
Right.
So again, they're considered part of by policy, the death team.
And so when the curtains open up, I remember the warden reading the execution warrant. There's a microphone right behind you so that everyone here in the witness rooms can hear.
That's right.
So they read the execution warrant, and then what happens?
After the execution warrant is read, the condemned is given an opportunity to give his final words. We were in the witness room that night. We heard those final words, and we worked together to kind of piece that together, what he had said. So at that point, once that is done, the warden gives the cue for the executioners to begin their process.
And I mean, by law, that is what the Department of Corrections is assigned to do. Once the execution warrant is read, and last words are given, and then the order is given to start the execution. And in Honie's case, it was lethal injection, and I remember there was an EKG right here on the table to monitor his heart.
That's right. So Chief Honie, if you remember, was keeping a close eye on that. He was checking it every so often, and he was the one that made the determination when the EKG showed that the heart was no longer beating.
Right. And then if it were firing squad, I imagine the same process would play out. Execution warrant would be read, last words would be offered, and then would these just open up? And
correct.
I mean, there probably would be no warning, I have to imagine. Gunshots would just be fired at some point.
That's correct.
Yeah. And then same type of process, check to make sure that the condemned is deceased. So once the condemned is determined to be dead, what happens then? I remember the curtains closed, so we really didn't get to see anything after that. But what happens next?
You probably remember we were in the witness room for quite a while before we were able to come into this chamber. I think it was probably close to an hour. Yeah. So first things first is the ME, the medical examiner, comes out to do their investigation. It was very thorough. That's what took the majority of the time last time. Now, in the most recent one, in Honie's case, we also made a discretionary call to allow his family to come in and do a religious ritual. So that was taking place after the ME came in. And then also, after that is done, the cleanup crew comes in. You probably remember the smell very distinctly once we came in.
The smell of bleach.
Yes. Yeah. So that takes place, a thorough cleaning, and then the media witnesses were allowed to come in and make their note of what they witnessed.
And the body wasn't in here. The body was already removed from the chamber when we got a chance to come in here. But once the medical examiner is done with their investigation, what happens then?
So what happens is the body is then released to the medical examiner, and then it is no longer under the authority of the Department of Corrections. So the body would go to the medical examiner's office. The medical examiner makes arrangements with the family from that point.
Okay, so now we're on the other side of the wall of the execution chamber. So what happens in here? Who's in here during the execution?
So the night of the most recent one, we had the IV team and the execution team made up of the medical doctors. They were all back here. By state law, we are required to keep them anonymous.
Right.
We're not able to reveal their identity. Our executive director, Brian Redd, was also back here that night. But this is where they would push the drugs. This is where the IV lines run through. And then in the event of a firing squad, you see the rest here. Yep. And this is where the crew carrying out that would be doing so.
And in the event of a firing squad, who ultimately pulls the trigger?
So there's a team of 5 individuals. 1 would have a blank essentially, and then 4 would not. They are not members of the Utah Department of Corrections, however, they would be people who come from outside of our department.
And there's 1 blank in theory because the 5 people don't necessarily know if they had the blank or not.
That is the theory, yes.
Glenn, one thing I think is important to note is there are a lot of run-throughs that happen leading up to an execution. Can you talk to me about that?
This is really the most solemn and consequential responsibility of any state division. So it's really important that we handle it in a professional manner. And in order to do that, you have to practice for all scenarios. So that's exactly what we did. Weeks prior to the execution, we went through different scenarios, tried to think of anything possible that could come up to make sure that we run through that and are ready to go when the time comes. For example, an employee of UDC that matches the body type of the condemned volunteered. They were put through the transport process, they were put on the table, they were belted in, and even went as far as to put the IVs in multiple times on this individual, even to the toe. They had to try to find an IV line in that area. So he definitely took one for the team. He was bruised for quite a while after, but it's really crucial that we do those run-throughs. And you might even remember on the night prior to the execution, they did one just hours before, just to make sure that everything was in place and then it would go off in a professional manner.
And is there a checklist of if something looks like or starts to go wrong during the execution itself?
Absolutely. You have to really plan for any possible scenario that will come up.
And so that's it. That's how an execution takes place, whether it's by lethal injection or firing squad, basically from start to finish. However, there is one final step that happens after the execution with respect to Department of Corrections. What is that?
Well, it's important for us to really evaluate what happened. We spent months and so many hours planning for this. And when we take a look at how it went, you don't really want to talk about an event like this in those terms. However, we feel like it went as good as it possibly could have. Still, though, there are things we can learn. So there's a debrief session the following day, and you just get together, you go through each division and what your responsibilities were, and you take a look at what happened, how it played out, and what could potentially we could learn from moving forward. So that's really another important step, just to evaluate and assess ourselves.
So important, because while executions don't happen a lot here in Utah, they do still take place. The most recent one was 14 years spread apart from the previous one. Nationally, just over 1,600 executions have been carried out since 1976, and public opinion has started to shift away from the death penalty in favor of life without parole. A 2019 Gallup poll found that 60% of Americans preferred life in prison over the death penalty. We asked Utahns their thoughts.
Personally, I think it all depends on the situation.
Do you think that the sentiment around capital punishment is changing as, a new generation starts to come into its own?
It seems like people in the streets anymore. We don't have mobs that come out and watch it, bring your kids out and do that.
What is your stance on capital punishment?
My stance on capital punishment is I'm almost 50-50 on it, just because I feel like a lot of people are on death row that can be wrongly convicted. But for those that are rightfully convicted, I do feel like capital punishment is necessary.
Legal experts, prosecutors, and defense attorneys have debated the ethical considerations and legal complexities surrounding the death penalty. And then there's the appeals process. In Utah, inmates spend an average of 30 years on death row.
My feeling is if it's going to take that long, then do away with it. Otherwise, change the process. It can be changed. Other states do it. They still provide all the appellate rights to a convicted person and sentenced to death.
In Texas, for example, appeal is automatic and has to happen within 30 days. There's a much more expedited process to the state and U.S. Supreme Court.
It's really just kind of sitting down and changing the process. And if you're going to keep the death penalty, Utah State Legislature, then fix that. That is not working.
Utah House Speaker Mike Schultz is on record with 2 News saying, "I'm adamantly opposed to repeal. It helps solve cases. It's a deterrent for people to commit crimes. I don't want to take that tool away from prosecutors and families of victims."
So from that standpoint,
But defense attorney Sky Lazaro feels there's no useful legal purpose for it.
I think there's better ways to deal with even the most heinous of crimes.
Lazaro argues people change over time.
Life without parole, is its own type of death sentence. You're going to die in prison.
Sentencing guidelines look at aggravated and mitigating factors like was the crime a one-off or is there a history of violent decisions?
Government-sanctioned execution is not changing what happened. It's not bringing anybody back.
And Lazaro feels a shift in society's sentiment over the death penalty.
We've moved away from this idea that we're just going to punish bad people because they did a bad thing, into this idea that there's a rehabilitative component to a sentence.
Nationally, there has been a gradual shift in public opinion against capital punishment. But in Utah, there is still a majority of people who support it, including the legislature, which hasn't taken up death penalty reform since 2022 when it failed to get out of committee. Supporters say giving prosecutors the option to file a death penalty case helps leverage the accused to reveal the location of remains. But in the end, this debate is only possible because someone has been victimized, leaving families on both sides destroyed forever.
The memories of my mom I had of the murder scene, it was gone. I didn't have those memories right there. They were just pushed in the back. And just all the other memories of her were there.
It's just scary for everybody involved, and it creates collateral damage.
In the end, the death penalty remains one of the most divisive issues facing Utah and the nation. While advocates see it as a tool for justice and closure, opponents argue its costs, financial, moral, and human, outweigh any benefit. As Utah continues to grapple with this complex issue, the question remains, is it time for a change, or does capital punishment still serve the greater good? Thanks for watching. I'm Jim Spiewak.